May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
I think those who have been in the clergy community and the larger community of the diocese know how much I love this gathering. It is so much of a blessing to be with you at this time. And is it not an even greater blessing to be together this year? It's been very hard on everyone to be separated, grateful as we are for the great safety that separation has allowed for ourselves, our families, our communities, our neighbors, and grateful for the technology that has allowed it to take place. Grateful for your creativity, grateful for your faithfulness, and also how hard it has been. How hard it has been. So much of this service I've had the honor to be able to shape over these last 16 years. These are not the lessons that are assigned for Chrism Mass. That hymn that we sing every year is because I've chosen it for you, for us, and they seem very apt to me. Especially this wonderful hymn, which is going to usher me into a clearly defined theme, which I will get to in my normal way with you. But, I chose it partly because William Cowper wrote it. And Cowper was a great poet, and he was a chronic depressive. And he had tremendous bouts of depression that laid him low and caused him to not be able to function in his normal world. And you can feel this in his gratitude for being able to emerge from these periods of depression and from other struggles in our lives in the verses of this hymn, especially in my mind, when comforts are declining, God grants the soul again a season of clear shining to cheer it after rain. Well, here we are. Here we are. And while we would quibble that rain would be the struggle here in California, we wouldn't quibble that these periods of time where we are more intensely troubled, that we're so grateful when the sun shines again and when we can be together. There is no end to what we've been through. We understand that. There is, just as it is true in the environmental understanding of our world, that there is no away to which we can throw things. When I first read that, I went, of course. But I had used that phrase all my life. I'll throw it away. There is no away. There is no after. But there are differences, and we're so grateful for that. The gospel I chose because it has so much to do with healing. And we used it the last time we had Chrism Mass, whenever that was. This passage called the Sermon on the Plain has a different character, a different use in the Gospel of Luke than its parallel does in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's all about healing. It's all about healing. So today, what's on my heart is, what does healing do to the healer? And that's what I'd like to think about with you and open up for myself and for us to the extent that I can, this idea. What does healing do to the healer? Very recently, in preparation for Holy Week, Mark Stanger sent out a chapter, I think that's Mark, a chapter from a book of by a liturgical scholar, I think at Notre Dame, talking about Holy Week and especially about the Vigil. And in this chapter is some material on what has become common in this circle, understanding the sociological world of Jesus. And the author makes the point that it's not the same as our world. It's a world of guilt and shame and honor. It's a world of more personalism. It's a world of still shaped by agriculture, which for most of us, our world is not. We depend on it, but it's not our world. But what really got me, because I've been preparing to be with you, is something that it didn't talk about so much, which is the whole idea of clean and unclean. The whole idea of clean and unclean. It's not gone. It's not absent from our lives, but it's different than the world in which Jesus lived in the Jewish world of Jesus' time, in Judaism of that time. We still have areas, and I think here of St. Francis and his aversion to lepers, his fear of lepers. And that was about touch. And it was not ritual uncleanness, but it was aversion from that which would make a person unclean in the time of Jesus, make Jesus unclean. So this idea of healing, of making whole, has, as we know, two great aspects. One is what medical folks do, and ultimately what God does, which is the cure part, making our bodies and our minds sound again, removing disease. And it says Jesus does this. Jesus is curing people who have come with diseases. And what I now believe, because it's so specific, the unclean spirits, I now call that decolonizing the people of the time. I think that is really what's being indicated. Jesus is decolonizing people who have been infected with the ills of empire in his world. So these two things are happening. Neither of these things require touch. And we know that. We know that there are moving accounts of Jesus curing people and casting out unclean spirits all through the Gospels that happen without touch. So the touch is deliberate, and it is another form of healing, of making whole. And here it says there's a great multitude, and I invite you to think about this scene. In Chinese Buddhism and in Indian Buddhism, there are these wonderful icons of the reading of the Dharma, of the proclamation, of the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And you see painted in the icons great crowds of people who are listening to the Dharma being proclaimed. And this is what this looked like. Jesus has prayed on a mountain all night long by himself. Then he calls a great group of disciples to him at morning when dawn breaks. He names 12 to be the apostles, and then they go down from the mountain onto a level place, and then the crowd of disciples array themselves around him, and then a much greater crowd, and it names the regions from which they come, surround them. And you can see it sort of taking almost a formal liturgical shape of Jesus and the 12 and the greater crowd of the apostles, of the disciples, and then this great crowd, and they've all come to hear him and to be healed. And this happens. It says that many are healed. Everyone's being healed. But, and here's the key for today, they're all seeking to touch him. They're all seeking to touch him. And it doesn't say that he said no. He let them touch him. And so, my friends, they were healed. Because he received the touch of unclean people. And that made them whole. They were reincorporated into the body of the community by his graciousness in allowing himself to become unclean. Because this is what happened. By his allowing them to touch him, this teacher, this person who observed and loved the law, became unclean. So his uncleanliness is the means for their wholeness, their becoming whole. This same gospel, of course, is the gospel that gives us only this gospel, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is Jesus' core teaching, in part, in that great parable, wherein everybody else, besides the Samaritan, passes far away from this man who has been beaten because he has been left for dead. And they've got business to do in the temple. And they can't afford to be unclean by touching a corpse. So Jesus is teaching us through that parable, and he's teaching us, the gospel is teaching us through this story about what it takes to heal people. And the reason I'm emphasizing this in this body today is because this is what you've been doing. This is what you've been doing with your whole vocation, your whole sense of being called as baptized people, as deacons, and as priests, and I as your bishop. This is what it's all about, is seeking to be channels of God's healing for the world. But I specifically wanted to focus on this today because during the pandemic, the worst of the pandemic, for which we are having a moment of bright sun, but we're still in, and the world we're still in, you have been doing this for your communities. And I'm so aware, I feel it, what a burden it is and what it has cost you. What it has cost you. And this is what Jesus experienced. I want to really emphasize that to you. This is what Jesus experienced. Many years ago, I was told, and I have been told repeatedly, you're too sensitive, Mark. Get a thicker skin. And then later, there was a term. It helps to have a diagnosis sometimes. They said, you're an HSP, a highly sensitive person. This is a known thing. And then a person here in California, in these 16 years I've been with you, as your bishop said, I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you some tools to put a spiritual armor around yourself that will protect you from what? The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And this person taught me how to spiritually meditate and make this kind of armor around myself. And I dutifully did that for a while. And then I thought, no. I'm not criticizing this. I understand it. But I'm saying that for me, it wasn't the right path. Because I think, and I hadn't put this together with this gospel at that time, because I think I need to be touched by everyone. And so it costs us, doesn't it, to be touched. And you have allowed yourselves to be touched over and over again, day in and day out, by the people who need healing. And so you have become, understand me, unclean. And what I believe Jesus felt was not imperviousness to that touch and to that uncleanness. I think that wounded him. He felt it. He loved the law. It meant something to him. So to become unclean was a deliberate act of vulnerability that cost him something. Henry Nouwen helped us all understand this process of the wounded healer. But this is different. This is being wounded in the healing. This is being wounded during the healing, and the wounding is part of the healing. And this is what you've been doing. So what do we do then? I think of water flowing. And Jesus said, memorably, that from the believer's belly will flow streams of water. But what about into the believer? This is what we're looking at today. And where does it go? Where does that hurt go that you have received? Where does the burden go that you have taken on? Where does the touch go that has made you unclean? Where does it go? Well, that is where we need a spiritual practice. Because it can, staying with this idea of water, it can pool up in you. It can pool up in me and become stagnant and painful in a way that it was not meant to be, fetid, not flowing, not clean and pure. So we need to do something with it. And I think this is what Jesus was doing overnight. As he was preparing for this experience of healing on the mountain. Why was he praying all night long that night? Because he knew what was going to happen the next day. He was coming down the mountain, and he knew what would happen. He knew there would be people with illnesses and people with unclean spirits, and he would allow them to touch him. And so in prayer, he was letting the river flow the other direction. Not out of him, but through him to God. This, my siblings, is our call. Not only to allow ourselves to be touched, heavy as that is, beautiful and noble as that is, but then to not imagine that we can handle that on our own. That we must take it and immediately let it channel through us to the one who can receive it, and ultimately is the one who heals all of those in your community and ourselves. We must let the water flow through us. So finally, may I say that Jesus already knew all those people who would come to him in the morning to be healed. They were in him, just as they were later in person around him. The universe was present in his heart. And because God was in his heart, deliberately invited and conscious, the healing had already begun before he walked off the mountain and onto the level place. This is true for you, and this is true for me.